I would never have believed that my life could take such an extraordinary turn, capable of reawakening in me emotions that had been buried for years, a mixture of euphoria and fear that made me finally feel alive. I've lived with my husband Alessandro for 20 years now, and our routine has always been predictable, maybe too much. Don't get me wrong, I still love it, but that initial fire has long since died out, giving way to a monotony that sometimes suffocates me. I often find myself wondering if there is still something that can rekindle that spark, but everyday life tends to extinguish any desire for change. If you want to find out what broke this monotony and reawakened emotions that I thought were lost, subscribe to the channel. It was an ordinary day, one of those in which I found myself doing the usual household chores. While I was tidying up the garden, our neighbor Luca greeted me from the porch. At 70, anyone might think of a man in decline. But Luca was not like others his age. His skin was wrinkled, his hair was now gray, but there was something magnetic about him. Perhaps his penetrating gaze or the vigorous way of moving despite his age. There has always been a friendly relationship between us. Luca has been a widower for a few years, and we often stop to have a chat. Every conversation with him was a pleasant diversion, a little moment of escape from my suffocating routine. That day, however, something was different. He invited me to drink coffee together, and I decided to accept, even if only to break the monotony of the day. We sat on his terrace and started talking about this and that, but the conversation soon became more personal. Luca told me about his loneliness, how much he missed human warmth, company. He told me about the nights he spent alone, about how the house, despite being well kept, always seemed too big and too empty. Without even realizing it, I began to confide in myself. I told him about my feelings of being trapped in a marriage that seemed to have lost its spark. He listened to me attentively, as if my every word had weight, and there was a sweetness in the way he looked at me that made me feel desired in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. "You are a beautiful woman," he told me at a certain point, with a calm that struck me deeply. It wasn't your usual superficial compliment. He said it like he meant it, like he saw something in me that even I couldn't see anymore. After that first meeting, I began to think about Luca more and more often. I found myself looking for excuses to pass by his house, hoping for a greeting from him. And every time our eyes met, I felt a shiver run down my spine. It wasn't just attraction, but a kind of comfort, the feeling of being seen and appreciated for who I was. One day, as I was returning home, he stopped me to ask me if I could help him fix a lamp in his house. Without thinking too much, I accepted. I entered his house, which was kept in perfect order despite his age. He led me into the living room and, while he fiddled with the lamp, I couldn't help but watch him. There was a certainty, a strength in his gestures that struck me deeply. I noticed how agile and precise his movements were still, as if he had never lost that vitality that often abandons people of his age. After arranging the lamp, he invited me to stay a little longer, and I accepted. We sat on the couch, and the conversation soon returned to us, to what was missing in our lives. He told me how he had lost his wife, how he missed her presence every day, but not only for the company. He missed the warmth, the affection, the feeling of being desired. The tension between us was palpable, and with each passing minute I felt a desire grow that I couldn't explain. At a certain point, without thinking, I approached him. Luca looked into my eyes, and I understood that he too felt the same attraction. My heart was pounding, but I didn't stop. Slowly he reached out, touching my cheek gently. It was in that instant that everything changed. He kissed me, a slow, intense kiss that made me lose all contact with reality. I felt alive, after years of apathy, the warmth of his touch, the security with which he wrapped me in his arms. Everything made me forget, for a moment, who I was and what I was doing. When we broke away, reality hit me like a punch. There I was, in my 70-year-old neighbor's house, after having cheated on my husband. But strangely, I didn't feel guilty. I felt alive. It was as if a part of me, that part that I thought had disappeared forever, had finally come back to light. "I should go," I said, but my voice betrayed my indecision. "You don't have to do that," Luca replied with disarming calm. "There is nothing wrong with seeking what makes us happy." His words remained suspended in the air, like a promise, a chance to find a part of me that I had lost. Maybe he was trying to justify what was happening, or maybe he really believed it. At that moment, it didn't matter. I felt attracted to him in a way I couldn't explain. It wasn't just physical desire. It was something deeper, the feeling of being understood, seen for who I really was, not just as a wife and mother. Luca saw me as a woman capable of desiring and being desired. I approached him again, unable to resist the urge. The second kiss was more intense, more desperate. Luca took my hand and led me towards his bedroom. Each step seemed to erase years of routine, of boredom, of dissatisfaction. I didn't think about Alessandro. I didn't think about what all this meant. I was alone there, with Luca, and I wanted to let go. I felt that, for once, I had the right to think only of myself, to put my desires first, without thinking about the consequences. When we got to the room, he stopped me for a moment, looking into my eyes, as if to ask me if I was really sure. I replied to him with a shy but determined smile. There were no more words, only gestures, hands that explored, mouths that sought answers to questions that neither of them dared to ask. Our night together was a whirlwind of emotions. Luca, despite his age, knew exactly how to make a woman feel desired. There was a sweetness in his gestures, an attention to my needs that I hadn't felt in a long time. I let myself go completely, forgetting every limit, every rule. It wasn't just a physical act, but an emotional connection that brought me back to life. Every caress, every whisper seemed to give me back a piece of myself. The next morning, as the dawn light filtered through the curtains, I realized that I felt no remorse. I watched Luca sleep next to me, and a sense of peace enveloped me. It wasn't the end of something, but the beginning of a new awareness. Maybe I didn't know what the future held for me, but for the first time in years, I felt ready to face it. His wrinkled skin, his slow but firm movements, everything combined to create an experience unlike any other. Every little detail about Luca seemed to tell a story, and his body, marked by time, sent me a warmth that I hadn't felt in years. I felt safe in his arms, as if nothing outside of that room could touch us. Every touch, every whisper was a discovery, a journey into a world I had forgotten. Every touch of his fingers made me shiver, as if an invisible thread held us together, bringing me back to life, piece by piece. With every minute that passed, I realized how much I missed this kind of connection, the ability to be vulnerable, open, without masks or filters. It wasn't just the sex, it was so much more. It was intimacy, feeling close to someone in a deep and sincere way, something I hadn't felt with Alessandro in years. Have you ever felt trapped in a routine, unable to find that spark that once made you feel alive? What would you do to change this situation? Write it in the comments. I'm curious to read your stories and experiences. Luca knew exactly how to make the walls I had built around me collapse, how to penetrate my fears and my silences. And when we finally abandoned ourselves to each other, I felt fulfilled in a way I had never felt before. I felt alive, full of an energy I didn't remember possessing, as if all the parts of me that had remained dormant had finally been awakened. It was as if my body, my heart, had found a forgotten rhythm, a beat that shook me inside, filling me with life. Afterwards, we lay together, his breathing calmly next to mine. I felt incredibly calm, as if I had found a part of myself that had been hidden for too long. But with the calm came the questions. What did all this mean? Was I ready to continue living a double life? And what would have happened if Alexander had found out? But in that moment, with Luca next to me, I didn't care. I didn't want to think about the future. I just wanted to enjoy that moment of stolen happiness. I wanted to savor every second, every heartbeat, as if that night were a dream too good to end. The next morning I woke up early. Luca was still sleeping next to me, his face serene, unaware of the storms that were starting to form in my mind. I had to go. I couldn't stay there for too long. Alessandro would be home from work in a few hours, and I didn't want to raise suspicions. I dressed in silence, trying not to wake him. But just as I was about to leave the room, I heard his voice. "Will you come back?" I stopped with one hand on the door handle. Was "you'll come back" really what I wanted? Once again, that feeling of being alive, of being desired, hit me. I turned to him and nodded without saying a word. Then I left the house, trying to put my thoughts in order. I walked quickly towards my house, my heart pounding, trying to convince myself that no one had seen me. The fear of being discovered gripped me, but there was also a part of me that couldn't help but smile. Once I got home, normality hit me like a cold wave. The kitchen was exactly as I had left it. The dirty dishes, the shopping list taped to the refrigerator, everything seemed in its place, except me. I felt out of place, as if my body was here, but my mind remained with Luca. I looked at the clock. Alessandro would be home soon, and I had to go back to my usual life, as if nothing had happened. I had to regain control, go back to being the attentive and devoted wife. But something inside me rebelled against that prospect. I tried to tidy up the house, to engage in some activity, to not think, but every gesture took me back to that night. I wondered how I could have let myself go so easily. How could I have betrayed a man who, despite everything, had always been by my side? Yet I felt no remorse, at least not in the way I should have. I was confused, but inside me there was still that spark, that desire to experience something I had never allowed myself. Every corner of the house seemed colder, more distant, as if my very life had lost its warmth and color. When Alessandro came home, he hugged me like he did every evening. His embrace seemed different to me now, more distant. His presence reminded me that the quiet life we had built together, with all its certainties and habits, was no longer enough. But he didn't notice anything. There was no reason for him to suspect, and I, somehow, continued to play the part of the perfect wife. Every gesture, every word was a mask, a script that I knew too well. Yet as I smiled and talked to him about the day, there was a part of me that screamed, that wanted something more. During dinner, my mind constantly returned to Luca, to his eyes, to his touch. I wondered what he was doing at that moment, if he was thinking of me like I thought of him. I said I would return, but when and how could I do so without arousing suspicion? His image overlapped with everything else, like a ghost I couldn't chase away. Every bite of food, every word from Alessandro seemed empty to me compared to the intensity of what I had experienced with Luca. A few days passed and I tried to ignore the desire to see him again, but it was impossible. Every time I left the house, I hoped to meet his gaze, to hear his voice. The thought of him haunted me. I found myself looking out the window, looking for his profile among passers-by, imagining receiving a message from him. Finally, one afternoon I decided to go back to him. Luca welcomed me with a smile that made me tremble. There was no need for many words. We immediately hugged, and I knew I no longer had control over what was happening. It wasn't just a physical attraction. It was much more. There was a bond between us that was growing, and that scared me. But at the same time, it made me feel incredibly alive, as if I was discovering a part of myself that I had forgotten. Our relationship became a secret that I jealously guarded. Every time I was with Luca, I felt alive like never before. He knew exactly how to make me feel special, how to trigger emotions within me that I had long buried. And in those moments, I forgot everything. My husband, my previous life, the consequences. But living a double life began to take its toll. Hiding my outings, inventing excuses to spend time with Luca made me nervous. Every time Alessandro asked me something, I feared I wouldn't be able to lie with enough conviction. I felt more and more on the edge, as if I was walking on a thin wire, ready to fall at any moment. But surprisingly, he didn't seem to suspect anything. Maybe he was too busy with his routine to notice my changes. Or maybe he simply trusted me blindly. One afternoon, as I was leaving the house to meet Luca, I noticed my neighbor Francesca looking at me from afar with a suspicious expression. I didn't think much of it at the time, but a small sense of alertness began to creep up on me. What if someone started asking questions? What if someone had understood what was happening between me and Luca? I ignored that thought and headed towards Luca's house, as I had been doing for weeks. Every step towards him seemed to take me further and further away from my previous life, from what I had been. When I arrived, he greeted me with his usual warmth, but I immediately noticed that he too seemed worried. "Did anyone see you come in?" he asked, lowering his voice as if afraid of being overheard. I shook my head, but inside I began to doubt. There was always the risk that someone would notice my visits, and I knew we couldn't continue like this forever. There was a shadow growing over our lives, a threat we could no longer ignore. I felt like we were running out of time, and that we would soon have to face reality. But I wasn't ready to let go of what we had created yet. However, the idea of ending that relationship left me feeling empty. Every time I thought I wouldn't see Carlo anymore, I felt a pang in my chest, as if a piece of my soul was being torn away. "We can't let ourselves be discovered," Carlo continued, caressing my face. His touch was delicate, almost as if he wanted to calm the turmoil that was unleashing inside me. "You have to be careful." Those words suddenly made me feel vulnerable. I had entered a dangerous game, and now I was starting to realize that the consequences could be devastating. The following days passed in a whirlwind of anxiety. Every time I saw my neighbor Francesca looking out the window, or I realized she was watching me, my heart accelerated, beating as hard as a drum. She seemed more and more attentive to my movements, and even Giorgio, who initially didn't seem to notice anything, started asking questions. "Where were you yesterday afternoon? Did you leave work early?" he asked me one night at dinner. His tone casual, but his eyes trained on me with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. His gaze seemed to pierce me, as if he could read my every thought, every hidden secret. "I went to the supermarket," I replied, trying to keep my tone natural, but inside I felt my heart beating fast, my hands shaking slightly. I was losing control of the situation. Despite the caution with which Carlo and I tried to carry on our relationship, I felt that the circle was tightening. Every look from Giorgio, every question from Francesca was like a rope that slowly tightened around me, taking my breath away. After dinner, while Giorgio was watching television, my cell phone vibrated with a message. It was Carlo. "We need to talk. Urgent." I felt a knot in my stomach, as if an invisible hand was squeezing my soul. What could have happened? I slumped in my chair for a moment, trying to calm my breathing, but the sense of panic wouldn't lessen. The next day I went to Carlo with my heart in my mouth. Every step I took seemed heavier than the previous one. When I arrived, I found him sitting in his living room, looking worried. His eyes were ringed with tiredness, as if he hadn't slept all night. "Francesca knows everything," he told me without preamble. I felt my blood freeze in my veins. The world around me began to spin slowly, as if in a spiral of fear. "What does that mean?" I barely managed to whisper, my voice cracking with terror. "He saw me go in and out with you several times. He asked the neighbors questions and told me clearly that if we don't stop, he will tell Giorgio." I felt myself sinking. Carlo's words echoed in my mind like an echo, and I felt like I was sinking into a bottomless abyss. Francesca was a gossipy and influential woman in the neighborhood. If he actually decided to talk, my whole life would fall apart. I could imagine Giorgio's face as he discovered everything, the pain in his eyes, the sense of betrayal. The fear of being discovered suffocated me, and for the first time I began to question everything I was doing. Carlo looked me in the eyes, serious, and there was a hint of resignation in his eyes. "We have to stop. We can't go on like this." Those words, although rational, hit me like a punch in the stomach. Part of me knew he was right, but another part didn't want to let him go. I had clung to him like a lifeboat in a sea of dissatisfaction and monotony, and now that lifeboat was sinking. I felt like I was at the mercy of the waves again, with nothing to hold on to. "Yes, you're right," I whispered, my voice cracking with emotion, tears filling my eyes. "We can't risk it." I felt my heart break as I said those words, as if I was giving up a part of myself. When I returned home, I sat on the sofa next to Giorgio, but I couldn't stop thinking about Carlo. Every corner of the room seemed foreign to me, as if I no longer belonged to that life. Our bond, which had started as an escape, had transformed into something deeper, like a flame that had ignited parts of me that I thought had been extinguished forever. Every time I closed my eyes, I relived the moments we spent together. His hands caressing my face, the warmth of his embrace, the way he made me feel alive, desired, as if for the first time someone really saw who I was, beyond appearances. His smile, his eyes looking at me, as if I were the only important thing in the world, everything made me breathless. But now I had to face reality. Our story was destined to end, and I had to make a choice. Continue to live a lie, risking losing everything I had built with Giorgio, or close that chapter and try to rebuild my life, even if without that spark that Carlo had rekindled. I felt tears welling up, a lump in my throat, as I wondered if I would ever be able to truly let him go. That evening, while Giorgio slept next to me, I tossed and turned in bed, tormented by thoughts. I realized that despite everything that had happened, I was no longer the same person as before. Carlo had shown me a side of myself that I didn't know, a passion, a desire that I thought was now extinct. And now I couldn't just go back to my old life, pretend that nothing had happened. The next morning, I got up early and went to Carlo for the last time. I found him in the garden, busy pruning his roses. The scent of flowers mixed with the fresh morning air, creating a surreal atmosphere. When he saw me, he immediately knew I was there to close that chapter. We looked at each other for a long time without speaking, aware that this was the end. There was no need for explanations or apologies. We both knew it was the right thing to do. "Goodbye, Carlo," I said, in a small voice as I turned and walked away without looking back. I felt his gaze on me until I disappeared from his sight, and every step felt heavy as lead. Every fiber in my body wanted to go back, but I had to keep going. When I returned home, I felt an emptiness inside me, a dull pain that tightened my heart, but at the same time a strange sensation of peace. I was aware that my life would never be the same, but perhaps it was time to look forward, to rediscover who I was without the weight of lies and secrets. Things were not easy with Giorgio. Even though he knew nothing about my betrayal, our relationship needed work. I felt distant, as if a part of me remained elsewhere. Every time he smiled at me, I wondered if I would ever be able to look him in the eyes without feeling that weight of guilt. Maybe I would never again feel that spark I had felt with Carlo, but now I knew what I was looking for, what I really wanted. I was ready to build something new on a more solid foundation, with no more secrets between us. That day, as I closed the door behind me, I felt the weight of the past slip away. It was as if a light wind had freed me from all the invisible chains that had held me back. I didn't know what the future held for me, but I was ready to face it with a new awareness of myself. An awareness that, despite everything, I deserved to be happy and that I could still find my way, even if it was different from what I had imagined. If you want to receive new videos of the series, write, "I want the sequel," in the comments. If you liked the video, leave a like and subscribe to the channel to receive a preview of the next publications. Thank you.